Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani here. Let's talk a little bit about indifference because I talk about indifference and how important it can be to help you deal with narcissistic relationships and healing, but I recognize now, based on some questions I'm getting, there's a certain lack of clarity about it. So let's break down indifference. Indifference is an interesting issue, right? Because I think some people are like, there's a deadness to it, but I think it's so important. And so I'm going to break it down because, like I said, clearly it's complicated. So indifference is so tricky. When you're in a narcissistic relationship, after a narcissistic relationship, it's dangerous to fake indifference too. Some people may say, ugh, I don't care what happens to them anymore. But if you still want a particular outcome to happen in that relationship, for example, you want their life to blow up because they broke up with you, or you want their new partner to leave them or cheat on them, or you want their business to go kaput, then you're not indifferent, right? Now, I've talked widely about indifference as this sort of destination in healing. But I think what I've said is probably too simple because I see now very clearly there are levels of indifference. And most of us, frankly, I don't think are ever going to get to that highest level of indifference in our most impactful narcissistic relationships, whether we're in them or not. Indifference is a hazy word. It can mean different things, but it's not as simple as, ugh, I'm over him. When you're not over him, but saying it helps you feel better, that's not indifference. It's much more complicated than that. Now, the problem with faking indifference is that you walk around saying, ugh, you don't care, and you start to think you're indifferent, but then you wonder, why am I not farther along in my healing? Now, indifference takes in different categories, right? Understanding that can also help you understand the power of indifference as a part of healing from narcissistic relationships. So the first kind of chunk of indifference is that there's indifference about how the narcissistic person is doing or what's going on in their lives. Honestly, in a weird way, this might actually be the easiest part of the indifference matrix, even though it can still feel very out of reach, especially if it's early days since the relationship ended, or if for any reason you still have to have some level of ongoing contact with the narcissistic person and the things they do are still problematic, right? But I say easiest to mean, relatively speaking, no, it's not easy to get here, but you'll get there. And there's a day, I'll tell you, there's a day when you're just no longer give a shit. You really don't care what happens to them. But on both sides, you don't care if something good happens to them, and if something bad happens to them, you just don't care, right? That people get there, and they get there all the time. Now, the second chunk of indifference is the indifference you would feel, or whether you'd feel indifferent, if you ran into them or heard about them. Now, this could be running into them in the street by coincidence, or having friends that still stay in touch with them tell you about how they're doing, or seeing a photo of them on social media. This may actually be one of the harder forms of indifference because cognitively, that first chunk of indifference, you may actually not care what has happened to them, but seeing them in person or even seeing a picture of them can still leave you feeling physiologically uncomfortable, a sort of sympathetic nervous system reaction that feels very uncomfortable. And listen, our bodies hold the hurt of a narcissistic relationship. And you may feel this hurt for a lifetime. It's almost encoded in your psyche and in your body. And you might not only need narcissistic abuse therapy, but even trauma therapy to cut to the core of it. It's hard to get fully past it, and I do believe that you can have those uncomfortable physical reactions if you see them or some other physical reminder of them and still feel indifferent to them. What is more telling, though, is let's say you did run into them. Do you ruminate about it a lot afterwards? You may run into them in the street, you might see a picture of them, get a piece of news about them, whatever, and then spend days or weeks thinking about them to the point of distraction. Then that is a more cognitive process, and it may mean that you're less indifferent because they can still really affect you. Then there's the third kind of chunk of indifference, right? And the third form of indifference is indifference about what the relationship did to you. Now, again, this is a difficult point to reach because if the narcissistic relationship was long-lasting or problematic enough, They change us. And I think this is obviously most pointed with narcissistic parents when you recognize what the internalization of their voices did to you and the setting of the trauma-bonded patterns which still affect you and resulted in even more issues as you went into adulthood. You may feel it in how you held yourself back in life. The greater the impact of the narcissistic relationship, the less likely you are able to get fully indifferent about what it did to you. I don't even know if, I think it's a misnomer. I don't think I'm calling her. I don't even think it's indifference. It may come down to being able to succeed and live an authentic life despite these things happening to you. It may also be harder to get to a place of indifference about what the relationship did to you. If it relates, for example, to the breakup of a marriage, the effect on children, lifelong impact on finances, home, family, that blast zone may persist and be very difficult to get indifferent about, especially if children were involved and are still hurt. Now, in this case, it may be less about being indifferent to your own pain, and I don't think being indifferent to your pain is ever a good thing, but rather having enough healing unfold that you might be able to get to a place where you can look at the lessons you learned. Again, I do believe that the more severe the narcissistic abuse and the longer it lasted, the less likely a person can completely move beyond the feelings of what this relationship did to you. So, given these sort of chunks of indifference, we can take all of that and mix it up so you can understand what I'm calling now these levels of indifference. I just want to keep this indifference thing real and let you know that you're probably making a lot more progress than you think. So let's start at level 0. Let's call it not at all indifferent, right? Not indifferent. You still care. You're still vulnerable to being hoovered. You're still deeply hurt. You still engage and get into it with them. You ruminate a lot. You may even be ambivalent. You may have very strong negative feelings towards them. You might even have some positive feelings towards them. You may still wonder what's possible, what can be salvaged. You may want to make it work. You may definitely not be anywhere near radical acceptance. This is what people in these relationships or still in the trauma-bonded loops are stuck in. Level 0, no indifference. Now let's go up to level 1. That's what I'm going to call the lowest level of indifference. You might be a little detached now. You may not even want back in if you're out of it, but you're still bothered and you want them to suffer. You don't want them to do well in their lives. You're still feeling the pain of what they did, and you still feel some maybe uncomfortable resentment about how this relationship affects you. If you're out of the relationship and then you saw them, it would be unsettling. And if you heard they were doing well, it would get you really mad. Hearing their name may still bother you. But some of the indifference may slowly be setting in. You're more detached. No contact or low contact may not feel effortful. You aren't wondering what they are doing, even if you are still in the relationship. You may ruminate a little, but could go days, weeks, and even months not thinking about them if the relationship's done. But reminders of them still bother you. Or seeing them, for example, if you have low contact, like you're co-parenting or something, is still very uncomfortable because their toxicity still gets a little under your skin. So now let's go to level 2. Let's call this the middle level of indifference. Here, you really don't care, and you're really not that bothered by them doing well. You might get a little bit of a chuckle out of them doing badly, but it's not a top-of-mind issue for you. If you saw them, you might feel a little of that physical discomfort or maybe feel a little worried or scared, and you're still bothered, a little bothered, by what they did to you. You may reflect on some of the difficulties you're still having in your life and see how it traces back to those narcissistic relationships. People who are at the middle level of indifference are also at the front end of really being able to do a good job of extracting the lessons they learned in these relationships, and you may even be able to see some of the strengths that you have achieved within yourself despite this. Radical acceptance is well within hand at this point. You aren't waiting for them to change in any way. You are definitely disengaged. You would prefer not to see them, but if they're there, it may just take a day or two to recover. And then there's level 3, the top of the indifference mountain. Now, it can happen, but if you've had more severe long-term narcissistic relationships, or you still have a fair amount of contact with a narcissistic person, this is a tough get. But this is the highest level of indifference. You simply do not care about them, and you are not affected by them. If you find out that they got sick or fired, you really don't care. It may even feel a little bit like hearing about a stranger. If you found out they got married or won the lottery, you still don't care. You may just roll your eyes, but you don't care. You may feel a tiny wince if you see an old picture or run into them, but it doesn't feel like the 4th of July in your nervous system, and it doesn't throw you off your day. You may have mastered that sort of shrug, a sort of, it happened, my bad luck, and even be able to not just recognize that this relationship wasn't good for you, but you may even feel that you've learned something from it, and just have finally, once and for all, after a lot of work, moved on. You recognize a relationship changed you, not always in ways you're happy about, but you've learned and adjusted. Now, these levels of indifference happen differently for every narcissistic relationship. As I thought about this video, I thought about myself, right? And I reflected on about 5 key impactful narcissistic relationships in my life. Some old ones, some more recent. I gotta say, and I'm working on this, I got into level 2 on all of them and level 3 on one of them. I saw that I was stuck at level 2 because I still would have strong somatic and physical reactions if I saw the old picture or heard news about them, and I still felt some strong anger. Now, the level 3 person, in case you were wondering, was from someone from my life, over 25 years ago. This person really has no ability to hurt me the same way now, is quite old, but it was interesting. Another person from around that time of my life recently rolled into my inbox and asked if I wanted to get together. Haven't seen the person in that long. They're still in a relationship with the narcissist. This person who emailed me was her enabler. And I felt duped and angry, and I stopped responding to the emails. So I realized even that person I thought was a level 3, I might have to demote that to a level 2. And even a milder narcissistic person in my life I thought was a level 3, I found out he got a big award he didn't deserve, and I was pissed off for a week, so I level 2 to that person too. Level 3 may be a bit aspirational. I thought this other person from my past was a level 3, and then I was cleaning out old thumb drives, saw a picture, almost threw up. He went back to a level 2 as well. I honestly have to tell you, I didn't care. I didn't care what happened to any of these people. But my body was still affected because that relationship really hurt me. Gotta say though, at level 2, big healing can happen. And if you can crawl out of the narcissistic relationship and honor that it did change you, and hold grace and compassion, that you still hold that pain physiologically. At level 1, healing is happening, but it may sometimes get compromised and little setbacks. But that disengagement is already well underway. You aren't taking the bait. You know they won't change. Level 1 is all about moves that are happening in the right direction towards the beginning of indifference. Personally, I don't know if level 3 indifference is fully possible in more significant narcissistic relationships, or in situations where you still need to have contact with the person and they are still behaving badly. I don't think you can get to level 3 if the schism or the breakup or even the radical acceptance was recent. Some folks may not get to level 3 unless many, 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 many years have passed with no contact. So level 2 may be the indifference level that is the most realistic and accounts for the somatic wounds and the long-term sense of threat and the discomfort that these relationships leave us with. But I think what has happened when we talk about indifference is too many people think that it's level 3 or nothing, and that's not the case. As a proud level 2er here, I do believe that that indifference at that level allows me to recognize that, yeah, these relationships change me and how I go through the world, but also allows me to show myself grace when I am reminded of them and I feel sick. So let's keep it real when it comes to indifference. Because when you get there, when you no longer take the bait, when you don't engage, when you no longer take them seriously, and also give yourself psychological permission to psychologically step back or avoid them in the first place, that to me is one hell of a prize. Whether it's level 1, 2, or 3, we get there, but keep it real. Because in some ways your body is saying, oh hell no, I don't know that I ever fully will. And that's okay. Thanks again.